The Book of Kings is divided into two sections, Kings 1 and Kings 2. But originally it was one book, just as we discussed in our previous presentation on the Book of Samuel. And so we will treat the two books of Kings as one book because it tells one story. The books of Kings trace the history of Israelites from the death of King David to the destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile. The focus of the history in the Book of Kings is on the religious practice of the temple worship and on the religious faithfulness or lack of faithfulness of the kings who ruled the chosen people. The rise and fall of Israelite monarchy is what we discuss and treat in the Book of Kings. And so we begin. We are now yet again in the historical books of the Bible, where we hear stories about many different kings. Last time we left off with the Book of Samuel and David at the end of his life. The Book of Kings, first Book of Kings, begins with the death of King David. And King David, who offers last words upon his death, reminding the people the same theme as we have heard over and over again: be faithful to the Lord God, and you will prosper, and do not turn towards false gods. At the end of King David's life, it says in chapter 2, verse 10, David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. The length of David's reign over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. When Solomon was seated on the throne of his father David, with his sovereignty firmly established, is how it continues now. And so Solomon, a well-known individual from sacred scripture, the great son of King David, takes over the throne. And the first 11 chapters of the first book of Kings deal with the reign of King Solomon. During the reign of King Solomon, we hear again a very beautiful beginning of his reign. Overall, he is seen as a good king, as a wise king. During the reign of King Solomon, the city of Jerusalem and the land of Israel has grown to a great kingdom. And King Solomon certainly was able to establish himself as a ruler not by force but by wisdom. And we hear this particularly in the 3rd chapter, that Solomon, who is at a young age given this great responsibility to rule over Israel, feels overwhelmed by the responsibility and is given an opportunity to receive the gifts necessary to rule the Israelites. And this is how it goes. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, because that's what the most renowned high place was. Upon its altars, Solomon offered 1,000 holocausts. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, "Ask something of me, and I will give it to you." Solomon answered, "You have shown great favor to your servant, my father David, because he behaved faithfully towards you and with justice and an upright heart, and you have continued this great favor toward him even today, seating a son of his on his throne. O Lord my God, you have made me, your servant, king to succeed my father David, but I am a mere youth, not knowing at all how to act. I serve you in the midst of the people whom you have chosen, a people so vast that it cannot be numbered or counted. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding heart to judge your people and to distinguish right from wrong. For who is able to govern this vast people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon made this request. So God said to him, "Because you have asked for this, not for a long life for yourself, nor for riches, nor for a life of your enemies, but for understanding, so that you may know what is right, I do as you requested. I give you a heart so wise and understanding that there has never been anyone like you up until now." And so here we have the success. The key to the success of Solomon is in humility. He asks for what he feels he needs in order to fulfill his vocation, his call in life. A great insight to our own spiritual life. If we are presented with this opportunity, if God comes to us and says, "Ask for whatever you want and I will give it," what would we ask for? The most important thing we can ask for is exactly what we need to fulfill our mission in life, our vocation in life. And Solomon had this sense that, yes, I am a king now, and I need, above all, I need wisdom. I want to do justice to the gift that has been given to me. And I think that is a very beautiful way for us to look at our own lives. And instead of daydreaming, as often people are tempted to do, and to say, well, I wish I was someone else. I wish I had a different vocation. I wish my circumstances were different. Instead, Solomon's approach should be our approach, which is, instead of hoping for a different life, we ask God for the gifts we need to live our life, to be the best that I can be, to fulfill my responsibilities to the best of my ability. So the blessing upon my life, Solomon accepts his call in life, and he seeks God's God's help. And God is pleased with Solomon and gives him exactly what he asks for. He gives him wisdom. And we know from the story of King Solomon that his wisdom became so well known around the entire Middle Eastern region that he would have people come and visit with him. So much so that even Pharaoh's daughter was offered to him as a wife. Now, this was unheard of. The Egyptians never did this. We have to understand Egypt was the great power. And so it always worked the other way, where they accepted the daughters of other nations for the Pharaoh as wives in order to make peace with other nations. But it was never the other way around, where the Pharaoh's daughter was offered to the king of another nation as a wife. But in this case, this actually happened, and Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter, and not only Pharaoh's daughter, but many daughters of different kings and monarchs throughout the region, as a way of bringing about peace and expanding the kingdom that was given to him. Pharaoh's wisdom has helped him to rule and grow the kingdom without waging war, and that was an incredible gift given to Solomon. One of the great successes of Solomon's life was the fact that he built the temple in Jerusalem. We remember that King David was the one who actually established Jerusalem as the capital of the kingship in the Holy Land. And King Solomon, even though King David wanted to build God the temple for the Ark of the Covenant, God said, no, because of all the wars you've waged, I will not let you do that. Instead, I will build you a house. And that was the prophecy that from David's line, the great king will come who will establish the ultimate temple. Remember what Jesus said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And he was speaking about the temple of his body. And so Jesus is the fulfillment of that promise to David. But King Solomon was able to build the temple, a beautiful temple for the Lord in Jerusalem. And the description of the building of the temple is provided for us in the 6th chapter of the first book of Kings. King David, because of his wisdom and the ways in which he was able to make alliances with other nations, became extremely rich and extremely popular. Many people would come to him to test his wisdom, and no one was disappointed. King Solomon is known not only for expanding the kingdom of Israel and for providing wisdom to the people, but also for many of his gifts were in writing poetry and songs, being a great builder, being a great judge over the people. There are 3 books in the Bible attributed to King Solomon. The first one is the Song of Songs, which was written in the younger years of King Solomon. And it's a book, if you've read it or if you will read it, you will know it's a book about a beautiful love between a man and a woman. The second book, written during his maturity, when he was in his middle age, was the Book of Proverbs. And that book is filled with wisdom, practical wisdom for everyday living, how to act, how to live, how to make decisions. And the last book, written probably at the end of his life, is the Book of Ecclesiastes. We know it from the famous reading from Ecclesiastes we often hear at funeral masses, when we say, for everything there is a season, there is a time to live and a time to die, a time to laugh and a time to cry, a time to sow and a time to tear. And so At the end of his life, unfortunately, Solomon did fall into a number of very serious sins, which caused him great melancholy at the end of his life, where he regarded even his wisdom as not the ultimate gift, when he said, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." And so, not wisdom itself, but obedience to the Lord through fear of the Lord is really the greatest kind of wisdom. And in that, Solomon mainly succeeded, but he also failed at the end. Solomon's great gift then was knowing what to ask for and knowing what to pray for, and having a genuine love for God and desire to worship God, to build the temple, to encourage temple worship. But his weakness was also the fact that in making alliances through marrying of these different women through different tribes, different kingdoms, he has allowed the influence of these wives to bring about worship of false gods into the kingdom. This is the ongoing struggle that we've seen in the past, and already, even with this good King Solomon, it's making a slow comeback. It is estimated that King Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Most of it, again, was political, in order to make these alliances and live in peace and not in war. But where he failed is that he, instead of introducing these wives to the God of Israel, he was influenced by them who introduced him to the worship of false gods. And so in the 11th chapter, King Solomon dies, and as he dies, he realizes that his sins were many and they were serious. In chapter 11 is the list of the sins of Solomon listed right in the Bible, and that's where his life ends. So he is considered a great king, a humble man, one who wanted to do the Lord's will and who did many good things, but also one who failed in the most fundamental ways in terms of his own faithfulness to God and his obedience to worshiping only the God of Israel and not other gods. Some would say his greatest fall was that he had too many wives. And that also, even though it's mentioned in the Bible, polygamy was never something that brought about blessings. Even though it was tolerated, one could say, it was never something God intended. And so it always brought about great pain and sin at the end. So this was the first section of this book. We can also look at the we'll look at that later, but if we look at this temple that Solomon built, this is the temple as we can best construct from the descriptions in sacred scripture. Supposedly it was an incredible building, unlike any building anywhere during that time. It just had the best of the best, and that was one of the great things about King Solomon, that he was extremely wealthy, but he was not corrupted by his wealth. In other words, he spent it on things like the temple, like worship of God, like rebuilding of Jerusalem. And so that was one of the great accomplishments, which would last for quite some time. But unfortunately, this is not the same temple as the one that Jesus would go and visit. This temple, as we will see at the end of the Book of Kings, will be destroyed because of the unfaithfulness of the kings who came after Solomon. This temple will be destroyed, and then another temple would be built in the same place during the time of Jesus by King Herod. And so that's the temple that again will be destroyed as Jesus prophesied, and then as it happened in the year 70 AD, and it was never to be rebuilt. To this day, when we go to the Holy Land, we can only see the remnant of one of the walls called the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall of the temple. At the end of King David's life, the Book of Kings enters into the second section, which could be called the divided kingdom. And so division comes after the security and peace that was found under the reign of Solomon. Here we see the entire region that was under the jurisdiction of the Israelites divided between the tribes. Again, remember, we started this whole thing in the book of Judges with different tribes being in charge of different regions. The land was divided, segregated, and then united under King David, and then strengthened under King Solomon. But after King Solomon, we begin to see the decline once again, the division. And so the division came between the north and the south. The north was called Israel, the south was called Judah. The north was the 10 tribes of Israel uniting together against the southern tribe of Judah and the little remnant of the tribe of Benjamin that makes up Judah in the south. The important thing here to notice is that Jerusalem was not only the civic capital of the land, but it was also the religious capital. That's where the temple was. And so in separating themselves from Jerusalem, the northern tribes truly separated themselves from God. And so they established their own political center in Samaria, and built a number of temples of their own where they worshipped God. But this was not what God wanted. And so, as we will see, the rest of the Book of Kings really traces the history of those two kingdoms, the north and the south, and how different kings throughout these two regions, both in the north and in the south, continue to fail in the faithfulness towards God and acceptance of false gods, promoting worship of false gods, and therefore failing in being unique than from other nations. The interesting thing about the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, which is Samaria, remember when in the Gospels we hear that there were Samaritans, right? That Jesus talks about the Samaritan woman at the well, or the Samaritan who is the one who takes care of the wounded man and takes him to the inn and takes care of him. Samaritans were seen as enemies of the Jewish people in the time of Jesus, and mainly because after the destruction of the northern kingdom, which happens after a while, we hear about this destruction of the northern kingdom. The Assyrians come from northeastern part of Israel. The main threat to the Holy Land was threefold. It was Egypt on the west, Assyria in the northern east, and Babylon in the southern east. And so Assyrians attacked Israel many times, and finally so much so that they overwhelmed and dispersed the entire northern kingdom. And so the Assyrians were known for doing something very interesting. They would not only take over the land, but they would also resettle the people. They would take them out of the land and disperse them throughout the Assyrian kingdom. And in doing that, they wanted to make sure that these people were divided and that they would not come back together, reunite, and fight against them and reclaim the land. And so what the Assyrians did is they moved most of the people out of the major cities in Israel and left some of the farmers, the simple people, stayed. but then they also brought in different nations from throughout their kingdom and settled them in the big cities that were left empty. And so Samaria was the main city where these different nations were brought in by were brought in, and then they intermarried with the Jewish people in the farmlands around there. And so when we talk about Samaritans in the New Testament, we are really talking about people who are half Jewish and half other nations. So the pure Jewish people, which in the time of Jesus really came from Judah, from the southern kingdom, really didn't look upon Samaritans as true Jews. And they looked at them as foreigners who were not worshiping properly. And that's where that comes from. But it comes from the main capital of the northern tribe of Israel. And we see during this time in the book of Kings, we see also that most of the prophets we read about in the prophetic literature in the Old Testament really come during this time. They're called by God during this time of various kings ruling in the north and in the south, and calling upon them to worship the proper God. And so here we have in the north specifically, we have the treatment of the two very famous prophets, Elijah and Elisha. They come and they are treated here at the beginning of the second book. Well, the end of the first book of Kings and the beginning of the second book of Kings, we have many stories about Elijah and Elisha. We have 7 miraculous stories about Elijah and what he did, stories we are well aware of. Elijah and the widow, the story in the 70th chapter when Elijah speaks against Ahab, who is the evil king of the north, and then he calls upon God for drought throughout the land, and then he goes to the widow and asks that the widow share some of the bread with him. The widow says, I don't have enough, only for my son and for me. So, and once we eat what we have, we will die because there's no more and there's a drought. And Elijah says, give me some of what you have and you will never run out. And so it happened. So this was one of the miracles. The other one that's very well known is Elijah calling upon the prophets of Baal. Baal was the false god, the pagan god that was introduced to the northern kingdom and was worshipped. And King Ahab certainly allowed for this. How did he learn about this prophet, this false god? Well, again, the same principle as what happened with King Solomon. Ahab married a pagan princess, and she brought these pagan worship practices to Ahab and taught him how to do it. And so we know her name, Jezebel. She was a very evil lady who is named here in chapters 18 and 19 of the first book of Kings, and who pursues Elijah after he destroys all the prophets of Baal with this miraculous event where he calls upon these prophets and say, you offer a sacrifice and call upon your God Baal to take it with fire, and then I will do the same, call upon the God of Israel, and we'll see who's right. And then Elijah is proven right. God accepts the sacrifice of Elijah, and then Elijah slays the prophets of Baal and then is pursued by Jezebel throughout the desert. And so we have this story of Elijah with many different miracles throughout his attempts to try to bring these kings back to the worship of the proper Israelite God. And then Elisha, who is his successor, he is called by Elijah and will succeed him. And there are many different stories that we're well of. Naboth's vineyard is another one where Elisha is called upon to go and call on Ahab, whose wife Jezebel has acquired the vineyard of the poor farmer by killing him. So many different stories. Elisha and the widow's oil and the cure of Naaman, which we hear often in the readings at Mass. All of these are associated with these two prophets, Elijah and Elisha, in the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom comes to an end, as I said, when Assyrians come and resettle the people, take them away, and the north is no more. The southern kingdom continues for a little bit longer. They have some good kings, but also plenty of bad kings. And so even the kingdom of Judah comes to an end when not Assyrians, but this time Babylonians come in and take over and actually destroy Jerusalem and destroy the temple. Book of Kings, the second book of Kings, ends with the deportation of the remnants of the people of Judah to Babylon. And we know the story, how they were taken away. It's almost a reversal of the book of Exodus, where they are taken from slavery towards the Holy Land, and now because of their disobedience they are taken from the Holy Land back into slavery, now not going west towards Egypt, but now going east towards Babylon. The book ends with hope. It ends with hope because it says that God will not abandon his people, but that God has permitted this penalty for the people. Once Israel favors other gods, God favors other nations. This is the story and theme of the Book of Kings. And so what is it that we take away from the reading of the Book of Kings? Certainly, we find many beautiful stories that are well known to us and that provide us with spiritual insights, how faithfulness to God is essential, how even in the darkest of times, even when our leaders, our kings, are unfaithful, we can still choose to be faithful. But the principle remains that when the kings, the rulers, are unfaithful to God, bad things happen and people fall apart and are divided. And so this is why it is so essential that we continue to pray for our leaders, both in the church and in our society. Not only that they may be good leaders, but that they may be faithful to God. Without that faithfulness, all sorts of false worship enters into the picture. All sorts of influence enters into the community that was established upon Judeo-Christian traditions. And then it becomes really a community that resembles more the Egyptians than the Israelites. You see, the Egyptians at the end of the Book of Kings, the kings of Egypt resemble more the pharaohs, the kings of Judah and Israel resemble more the pharaohs of Egypt than they do kings of Israel. And so they have in fact become like their enemies, like the people they were fleeing. And so this is the sad story, but also the important story that is told about the kings of the chosen people. There were some good kings who tried their best, but it seems that for every king, the good king they had, who wasn't perfect, they always had 2 or 3 bad ones who followed, who did sinful things in the eyes of God. And so how is the prophecy given to King David to be fulfilled? That there will be this one king who will be born, who will establish permanent temple, permanent worship, permanent peace amongst the people. Well, we know as Christians that can only happen in relation to Jesus, who is the true fulfillment, the only one who is able to establish what every human person longs for. And so the book of Kings ends with the destruction of the land of Israel, the temple, and the monarchy of the chosen people, but not with the destruction of the faith of the chosen people. Because even those remnants who go into Babylon, into exile, they will be restored. We know as we continue to read that they will return. They will be given an opportunity once again, because God never runs out of opportunities for us, for the people. So that's the Book of Kings, the book that offers not only great stories for us to remember and to reflect on, introduces the prophets and the important role of the prophets in the lives of those who follow God, but also it gives that beautiful, simple lesson that we all need to remember, which is faithfulness to God is the only recipe for peace and prosperity and longevity of our church, our relationships, and our interior peace. And so here we end our reflection on the Book of Kings, two books of Kings, books that are both beautiful and inspiring, showing the great prosperity and wisdom and peace that was accomplished during the reigns of King David and King Solomon, but also the downward spiral that happened during the succeeding kings, the division within the tribes of Israel, the pain and suffering that came from trying to become like everyone else, introducing these false practices and forgetting who they were. It will take yet another time of slavery in Babylon for them to once again relearn this lesson, which continues to be taught, and they continue to fail in long term in learning how important it is to stay with the basics, faithfulness to God, the one God, and worship of Him alone is the only path for all people who wish to experience peace and prosperity. So we end the Book of Kings, the book of the monarchy of the Israelites, the history, but also the religious significance of that history, that the people are being prepared over and over again for the one king who will come to save us from peril, from destruction, and from our over-attachment to the things of this world.